Now for today's program. Marc Weitzmann is an award-winning French writer and journalist, author of 12 books, and a contributor to Le Monde, Le Point, Tablet Magazine, and the New York Review of Books. His latest book, Hate, the Rising Tide of Anti-Semitism in France, which is a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice and an American Library Award, was released in 2019. In the Wall Street Journal, James Kirchick described it as an excellent and chilling rapport coup memoir about one of the most unsettling phenomena in contemporary Europe, and Roger Cohen in the New York Times Book Review as an often illuminating intensity as it grapples with an unresolved French and European quandary. Joining Marc today is Robert Siegel. For 30 years, Robert was the senior host of NPR's award-winning news magazine, All Things Considered. In 2018, Robert was awarded the Edward Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award in Journalism. He has been honored with 3 silver batons from Alfred I. DuPont, Columbia University, as well as an American Bar Association Silver Gavel Award. Currently, Robert is a special literary contributor to Moment Magazine and hosts Navigating the New Abnormal, a series of web seminars sponsored by American Friends of Rabin Medical Center on the JBS, Jewish Broadcasting Service Television Network. Please welcome Marc Weitzmann and Robert Siegel.
Suzanne, thank you. And Marc, it's great to talk with you.
Good evening.
Before we get to anti-Semitism, I thought we should start with the French community, the French Jewish community.
Mm-hmm.
Most Americans know that it's pretty big and it seems to be pretty scared from what we read. Tell us about who French Jews are.
Okay. First of all, sorry for the light. It's not related to the grim subject of tonight. Yeah, it's not a special effect. So the French Jewish community.
If you want to do
that. Yeah, great. So if a brief history of the French Jewish community, it dates back to the original Jewish community in France dates back to the Roman Empire, actually, when the Romans came to the Mediterranean, to the Western Mediterranean, and built the first counters there. The Jews were managing the counters. So it's a very old Jewish community that was expelled during the Middle Ages. But basically, the main difference between the French Jews and the American Jews is that we are divided between Sephardim and Ashkenazim much more than you guys are. Ashkenazi Jews have been living in the north of France, mostly around Strasbourg and Alsace and near the German borders. And later on, during the 20s and the 30s, they were joined by Polish Jews and the Jews from Eastern Europe that were moving away from Eastern Europe and going to the US. Some of them stayed in France. As for the Sephardics, mostly they came after the independences of the former empire, from Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, when they were expelled by the new regimes there. Some of them went to Israel directly, and a lot of them came to France, first in the south, and where they joined an older Sephardic communities that was dating back to the Middle Ages, and then to Paris and elsewhere. So this is the basic difference between the basic two Jewish communities in France. The Sephardics are culturally more religious than the Ashkenazim are, and also the Ashkenazim had to go through the ordeal of World War II in a much more violent way than the Sephardic experienced. The Sephardics were also subjected to the Pétain laws and discrimination during World War II, but because of the distance, they were not as, their lives were not as endangered as the Ashkenazim or the French Jews were in Maine, France during the occupation.
Whether the North African Jewish communities, the people who might be called Muslims, whether that's Sephardic migration, whether those people are comparably less assimilated into French life than older families that had been there for more generations.
Yes, to a point, yes, it's true. They're more traditional, if you will. They're also more connected to the Arab world, of course, than the Ashkenazim ever were. There's also a historical aspect in France because of during World War II, the Ashkenazi rabbinic establishment did collaborate with Pétain regime. And so it was totally discredited after World War II. So for that reason, it's one of the reasons why the Ashkenazim were more secular after World War II than the Sephardic ever were.
You're saying that
it's a process that
the Ashkenazim rabbinate was discredited by the way it handled the
yeah, absolutely. They were collaborating with the Pétain regime. They were pretty racist toward the Jews from Poland and Romania and elsewhere that had come to France to seek refuge there. And basically, the rabbinic establishment in France was basically anti-Semitic during World War in 1940. So it's one of the reasons why it was so discredited. The religious establishment after World War II was totally discredited. The first network of resistance that were managed by Jews in France in 1940 were managed by foreign Jews from Poland that were mostly secular. It was one of the great differences. When the Jews from the Arabic countries came to France in the 1960s, they reintroduced a religious element that had been mostly forgotten in France by the Jews after World War II. The Jews also they were basically looking for oblivion. They wanted to erase the memories of the war and the memories of the occupation after World War II.
I'll just add here as a footnote about the Vichy regime, that when the Germans came, they occupied much of France, and the part that they didn't initially occupy was in the hands of the great World War I hero Marshal Pétain, who famously said, "I make a gift of my person to the nation, to the French nation," and led what proved to be a collaborationist regime. I should say, though, that I read recently about, in Washington, for example, President Roosevelt was convinced throughout the war that they might be flipped, that they would at least keep the French Navy out of the war. And so there were people who did have completely unfounded hopes for the Vichy regime, that it might be something other than what it was, which was, I believe, as racist as the Nazis were in terms of dealing.
Oh, they were totally racist. Yes, absolutely.
So that was then. Now we have, as you say, the French community that survived the war and is still there, and the French community that has arrived and since the Second World War. How bad is it? How bad is the anti-Semitism for a Jewish citizen of France, a Jewish citizen who either identifies very publicly by kippah or by dress, or a French person who's pretty assimilated by appearance?
Yeah, you have to keep a sense of proportion. So it would be wrong to assume that Jews live in a state of siege in France today. So the situation has been going from bad to worse since 2000, basically. I would say that the situation of the Jews anticipated the situation of France at large that France experienced in 2015, 2016 with the terror wave that killed 236 people in the country in 18 months. Jews anticipate the Jewish fate anticipated that in France. The first murder of a Jew in France happened in 2003 in the wake of September 11 and in the wake of the Iraq War, basically. And then it got worse from then on. I don't know where to start because there are a lot of things to say, but in a nutshell, I would say that between 2000 and 2012, you had a series of random aggression against the Jews in the streets that were really the product of an impulsive rage from regular people, mostly Muslim people. And in 2012, this rage suddenly found a form, if you will, with the attack by Mohammed Merah against the Jewish school of Ozar Torah in Toulouse that killed 3 children and a rabbi. This attack was the turning point, after which it was clear that you were going from a unmotivated rage to a planned terrorist attack against the Jews, and then the third step of the process, if you will, was the beginning of the terror wave in 2015 with the attack at Charlie Hebdo and at the Hyper Kosher store in Vincennes. The difference, if you will, you went from blind rage targeting Jews in the streets to planned terror attack targeting everyone, but involving anti-Semitism as a way to legitimate the violence, if you will.
And to what extent? I mean, it sounds as if, and I think this is generally accepted, that most of these attacks that you're describing are not connected to neo-Nazis. That's not where it's coming from. It's not coming from the political far right. It's coming from the semi-assimilated, frankly, Muslim population of France, if not mostly North African. Fair?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely.
Since well, I remember when I used to speak with the Jews who lived in Hungary or Czechoslovakia back in the 1980s, I would ask if their bags were packed mentally, and many would say yes. Life is all right, but it could turn at any moment. Do French Jews typically, are their bags mentally packed to possibly leave France, or is it not that?
Not quite. No. When the violence began to rise in France, what happened was a inner exodus. People, there was a lot of fuss in the press, even in the international press, even in the American press, about French Jews leaving France, going to Israel. Yeah. It did happen to a point, but it didn't really reflect the reality. First of all, because Israel is not that far from France. It's 5 hours by plane. So a lot of the Jews who had the means to do so, bought apartments in Tel Aviv, for instance, just in case. And they would go there for vacations, if you will. They did not really stay there. And the ones that did go there often came back after a moment. What did happen, in fact, for the mass of the Jews in France was that they regrouped. A lot of them left the suburbs they were living in and regrouped in different towns inside of the country. So some cities went Judane Rhine, if you will, in France, and they are Judane Rhine to this day. And even in Paris, some neighborhoods were deserted by the Jews, who regrouped in the 19th arrondissement where I live, in the 17th arrondissement, and so forth. That's mainly what happened. Jews didn't really leave the country, but there's definitely a sense of estrangement,
yeah,
if you will. The feeling that we're not really, certainly in my case, for instance, I'm coming from a very assimilated family, and I know that I experienced things that I never imagined I would one day experience in my daily life. If we were, what we all have in common, religious Jews or secular Jews or assimilated Jews like me, what we all have in common is the feeling of being uprooted, even if we're still living in the country. I, for one, between 2000 and 2010, I went back and forth between Israel and Paris for 3 years, and then I went back and forth between New York and Paris for several years, because I needed to go away from France at some point. It's a very strong feeling.
Yeah,
it's a very strong feeling.
And I want to note in passing, when you mentioned the suburbs, the word suburb has a totally different set of connotations. A suburb, a banlieue of Paris, let's say, it was typically a place where the working class lived, and would it was not considered a sign of prosperity to have a long train ride into into the city.
No, the banlieue in France basically mean the projects.
The project,
if you want an equivalent. What happened in France is that the projects were built outside of downtown, if you will, the center of the cities. So the cities in France are kind of surrounded by projects, all of them, but especially Paris.
So the French politician whom I would associate most with expressing alarm over what Muslim immigrants to France and the children of Muslim immigrants and the grandchildren of what they're doing would be Marine Le Pen, whose father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, founded what used to be called the National Front. Now it's called the National Rally. And there's a presidential election coming up next year. Are French Jews, do significant numbers of them see in Le Pen, who is of the far right and a xenophobic far right, who did oust her anti-Semitic father from the party and tried to clean up the act a little bit, at least in public. Are French Jewish voters possible Le Pen voters?
Some of them, yes. Some of the Hasidim do vote for Le Pen, and they're not the only ones. There's a very perverse game at play, and I'm going to try to explain it in 2 minutes. It's a bit complicated, but I'll do my best to simplify it. It is true that Marine Le Pen tried to distance herself from her father, who had sympathies for the Nazis, and who had friends among French Nazis. And so she did try, and to a point, she did distance herself from her father. That said, she is surrounded by people that are not only close to far-right neo-Nazis, but also close to anti-Semite Muslims in Arab countries. There are connections, including financial connections, between the National Front and the Syrian regime, for instance. Also in France, the anti-Semitism in France was boosted by Muslim organizations, Islamist organizations to be precise. It's not just Muslims, it's Islamist organizations that set up the propaganda against the French and against the Jews in France, were helped by a Black comedian called Judane and his mentor called Alain Soral, who are both friends and connected with the National Front.
And the story, I remember we reported about this on NPR years ago. Judane, God-given, would be the translation of the name. Judane was a very popular Afro-French comedian who became a extremely popular cult figure, and at some point introduced into his comedy, having come up, I gather, rather close to a fellow comedian who was a French Jew. Judane introduced into his comedy.
Yeah, here I am.
Hi. He introduced a theme, an anti-Semitic. I'm just, while you were not connected, saying that Judane was a very famous character who at that point introduced anti-Semitism and I believe a Nazi-like salute or something into his.
Yes, absolutely. And Judane has as I said, Judane has connection to with the National Front, with the Front National, and friends of him are directly connected to Marine Le Pen. So it's quite a perverse game that's been played in France. During the 90s, you had basically two currents that were working in parallel to undermine French democracy. You had the Islamic networks, mainly coming from Algeria, whose propaganda was directed against democracy as a Western tool, and the Islamic propaganda was basically saying that Muslims should arise to defend patriarchal society and religion against Western democracy that undermined virility, that feminizes the Muslim world. That propaganda was directed toward the cités, the French projects, if you will. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, you had the far right propaganda, which we call in French the Red-Brown Alliance, former communists and former fascists that had united after the end of the Cold War all across Europe and were especially strong in France. And they basically said the same thing. They said that globalism, world democracy, and the American empire were the true enemy, along with the Jewish bankers, and they were to be fought by any means necessary. Some of those theoreticians from the far right were actively supporting Iran or the Islamists in Algeria. So you have this ideological connection, if you will, that's somewhere that's the background of the situation in France, if you will. Of course, the National Front is racist, and the Islamists are what they are, but they do share, to a point, the same enemy. That said, to answer directly to your question, yes, some Jews are inclined to vote for Le Pen. First of all, because as I said, there you have a lot of Sephardics in France, and Sephardics come from Arab countries, and they were expelled from the Arab countries during the independence, mm-hmm. after the War of Liberation in Algeria, Morocco, and so forth. And they have there's a lot of anger in them against the Arabs and against the Muslims, so they can, to a point, identify with the official discourse of the National Front, the racist part of the National Front. Also, they have less direct memory of World War II. They don't feel as connected as the Ashkenazim could feel connected to they kind of bore Jean-Marie Le Pen the same way that Ashkenazi do, if you will. An essayist like Eric Zemmour, I don't know if you're familiar with the name. Eric Zemmour is a French essayist who happened to be at the right of the National Front, very extreme. Mm-hmm. He would be closer to Bannon, if you will, if you want to find a sort of parallel. And Zemmour is violently anti-Arab and anti-Muslim, and also he's also a Sephardic Jew from Algeria.
Part of the backdrop of all this is a French idea of identity, of national identity, and of secularism, ideas that are different from American ideas. And mm-hmm. so that I became accustomed after a certain point in asking a French official, how many Muslims are there in France, or people would stare at me and say, well, we don't think that way. In fact, we don't ask. There is officially at least there is an idea that you are French, and that's that, and you don't wear garments that single you out as to school. The French school is a French institution. It's not a place for scarves or kippot or crosses, I guess. Is that idea is that idea coming apart? Is it falling apart these days in France?
Let's say it's in crisis, but rather than secularism or laicite, I think the real issue here is assimilation. And it's a very interesting subject, actually. I get more and more interested in it because the Jews were submitted to assimilation as well, and sometimes for the best, and sometimes not so much for the best in France. The notion of what's different, one of the differences with the US is that in the US, if you will, you come to the new country from the old, by tradition. The tradition in the US, as I understand it, is that you come from the old country to the new country and you leave behind everything to start afresh. You start a new life, you start in a new world, and you don't turn back to the past. And one of the key to succeed in that in the US is that you come with your whole story. You say who you are, where you come from, and as loudly as you can. That's the American tradition, as I understand it. In France, it's always been the opposite, at least since the revolution. You don't talk about the specifics. You leave the specifics behind. When the Jews were emancipated in 1791 during the French Revolution, the key thing was that they should forget their particularisms, if you will. They should become like every other French. The problem with the migrants, with the Muslims, is that most of those migrants do not come from an old country. Most of them came from the former French Empire. So they came with all the bitterness of having been colonized by an empire. And the former empire welcomed them with the bitterness of not being an empire any longer. So, right. So it's a very different situation. On the one hand, you have the assimilation process when you ask the migrants to erase their specificities and to keep their religions at home and not to show it to the outside. And on the other, you have this unhealthy situation where former colonized and former colonizers have to sympathize more or less by force. It can't work, and it didn't work. You know, I'm not. Did I explain did I answer your question?
I guess yes, and I mean I've always found something odd about the French relationship with the Jewish community, which you explain very well in the book, and the distinction that you draw that I'd like you to talk about a little bit is that you mentioned the extension of citizenship to the Jews during the revolutionary period.
Yes,
which was in a way, it was a very American act. We can relate to this, which is to say, you're going to become citizens in the sense that you will be covered by constitutional rights, or you'll by the law, by the codes, and you'll become a Frenchman through legal means, not because your great grand uncle watered the horses for the Crusades in whenever. And that you are French by virtue of soil and blood, and there's always been a thread in French life, or at least there was for most of the 19th and much of the 20th century. There was people who resented that this kind of feminine citizenship that Jews came by, which was here a law made you a citizen, as opposed to the citizenship of being not just a citizen of France, but you are French. You are by nationality in every way French, and your bones are French, and your family is French. I wonder if that distinction counts for anything. Is there still a functioning blood and soil kind of nationalism in France?
Yeah. What happened? Another difference with the U.S. is that in the U.S. religion was important, remains important, has always been important. It's part of the identity of the country. It's even part of the civil rights movement. It's at the root of a lot of things. Whereas in France, liberalism, the liberalism that helped to disenfranchise the Jews during the revolution was pretty much based on a form of secularism or another. What happened was that at the time, France was the first country to disenfranchise the Jews and to emancipate the Jews. But the paradox is that there was almost no Jews at the time in the country. Mm-hmm. During the French Revolution, there was no more than 40,000 Jews on 28 million people. So it was pretty much a symbolic act, if you will. It was a way to test what it is, what a citizenship can be. But it had practical consequences across the whole continent. The emancipation of the Jews, the consequence of the emancipation of the Jews was the liberation of the ghettos in Eastern Europe, and the rise of a secular Jewish world as we've known it during the 19th century and until Hitler destroyed it. The feedback was anti-Semitism because of this new situation created across Europe. France was accused of being too liberal, being rotten, being decadent. Mm-hmm. And for the French culture in the 19th century pretty much bought that. So the paradox, if you will, is that at the same time, whereas France was the first country to emancipate the Jews, it was also in France that anti-Semitism rose up as early as the first decades of the 19th century. And by the end of the 19th century, it was practically everywhere, if you will. So we have a strong tradition of anti-Semitism that is based on an anti-revolutionary trend, if you will, an anti-modern trend. And somehow it explains this is the backdrop, if you will, into which the Islamist network, when they came to France, they were helped in a way. The Islamist propaganda was helped by some sort of French history. Right. What they said found an echo in France, a certain tolerance, if you will.
Yes. Well, because even French liberal thought through the late 19th, early 20th century was very anti-clerical, and that was part of the general opposition to religions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they were people who were probably born, for the most part, born Catholic, and were opposing the power of the church and didn't want anybody to be very religious. Which you're right, it's quite a different. On the other hand, France has had a couple of Jewish prime ministers. At Léon Blum, it's had Pierre Mendès France. It's had people who own auto companies and aircraft companies. Have been French Jews. It's a very successful community.
Even today, Simone Veil was a very famous minister. She passed the abortion law. Robert Siegel, who's still alive, was the minister who abolished death penalty. There's Jews held permanent positions in France in politics. It's one of the contradictions of a country.
So there's one thing I want you to explain. This may take a couple of minutes. So before we take questions from from people attending, I want you to. So I found this fascinating in your book that Algeria. People may recall that there was a war that went on throughout the 1950s and early 60s. Algerians wanting their independence from France. Algeria had been part of France. It was not considered a colonial territory, although it may have fit the bill. But it was like Alaska and Hawaii are part of the United States, or today Guadeloupe and Martinique are part of France. Algeria was part of France before Nice became part of France. I had not known, I think, until reading your book. And when it became French, when Algeria was absorbed in this period when France had imperial ambitions or fantasies, I think you would go with the latter word, there was a question, what about the people who live there? What about, I mean, we understand the French colonists who've gone there, they're French. But what about the vast majority of people who live there who are Muslim?
Mm-hmm.
And what about the French Jews? And they all got a different deal, as I understand it.
Yeah, I lost the connection for a while, so I'm not sure I understand. I got your. Yeah.
I want you to describe how, when Algeria was made French,
Mm-hmm.
how the French dealt with the issue of whether Jews and Muslims, who also lived there along with French colonists, what kind of French citizenship or what their relationship to French.
Yes. So, okay, that's interesting because I think it's the root of the whole problem, actually. What happened, Algeria was conquered in 1830 by the French. By then, the tradition of enlightenment that had helped to create the revolution in France was in crisis, mostly because of the beginning. People were beginning to see the consequences of the Industrial Revolution. So progress was becoming a dubious issue. French were not so sure that reason and progress were the ultimate goal, as they had believed during the revolution and during the Napoleon conquests. So there was a crisis, and people were looking for a way out of the excesses of rationality, the excesses of the beginning of the big European life, all the world that Balzac is describing, if you will, the corruption of the big cities and so forth. They were trying to find an alternative to that, a solution out of it, and Algeria came right on time for that. When the French went to Algeria, they discovered a completely other world. They discovered Islam. And for a lot of officers of the imperial army that went to live there, Islam appeared as something that would offer another solution, something that would offer another solution to modernity. So they began to. You had the Jews living in Algeria, and you had the Muslims, and you had even some Christians. What happened was that in time, the French began to elaborate a special status for the Muslims that would be different than the status of the Jews and the status of the rest of the population. The reason for that you had a certain friendship that had been established between some quarters of the imperial army and of the colonial administration, and the imams that were hostile to modernity and to whatever France could bring to the country. So what they did was to elaborate a special status that would leave the Muslims keep their traditions, and in exchange, they would be set apart from the rest of the population. They wouldn't vote, for instance. They wouldn't have the right to vote. They would be official outcasts, but by being outcasts, they would be able to keep their traditions, like keeping slavery, for instance, or polygamy. And of course, the officers of the imperial army found their interest in that, because many officers converted to Islam to marry underage girls, if you will. It was a rotten deal, of which only the upper classes of the Muslim society could really benefit, because they were the ones who could buy slaves to begin with.
But
the people that really suffered from that situation were the lower classes of the Muslim populations that were deprived of means and deprived of everything, couldn't even vote, whereas the higher classes of the Muslim population could make deal with the imperial administration. That was really the perversity of the whole system.
And the Jews of Algeria, ultimately,
the Jews of Algeria, the imperial army, the imperial administration was very anti-Semitic from the start. And at first, the status, the Muslim status, was originally organized for the whole population of Algeria, Jews included. But the Jews didn't want that. They knew that in France, Jews were citizens like everybody else. So they fought the status and they won. And they, thanks to Jews in Paris who fought for them also, they became citizens. They escaped the special status, which created a potential conflict between people that had grown up together and were basically of the same culture and of the same population. But suddenly, because of that status, the Jews were being considered differently, were being considered as French, whereas the Muslims were being considered as outcasts. All that to protect what they called Muslim tradition.
And that's a difference, and that's a source of
that's the source of a lot of things that went wrong during the colonization in Algeria. Also because Algeria was a sort of test for the French imperialism. It was where France tested its imperialism, if you will, the way to manage the colonized populations, and the problem was that, if you will, the reason why it was such a rotten deal was that the official discourse of the official justification for that policy was the protection of the Muslim culture. That's the perversity of it. Yeah. And so it was the first. It was actually inspired by a Muslim convert. There was a Oriental advisor for Napoleon III, and so the whole policy was, if you will, we could say today that it was the first step toward an identity politics. We could call it that way. What it did was to leave most of the Muslim population out. In a state of quasi-slavery. Nobody cared about them.
Well, now, returning to the future, or the present at least, are there any, I mean, first of all, do you see any positive signs that the impulsive violence that we witnessed at the dawn of this century, and then the terror plots that sometimes it attacked randomly, but caught Jews up in that as well. Do you see any positive signs that things are getting better? Are you concerned that things are getting progressively worse?
It's hard to say. Better, I don't think so, because for in the book, I think I say that anti-Semitic violence is like, anti-Semitic acts are like a alphabet of terror, if you will, or sort of energy. It's the basic on which every violence is built. So as long as you have a regular anti-Semitic wave of incidents, we have, in average, we have 400 anti-Semitic incidents in France per year, which is half less than it was in 2014, but still very high. It's almost one a day. As long as we have that, we have a reservoir of violence, if you will, that can be mobilized for other kind of violence, other targets. The Jews are the violence against the Jews is the threshold, where it's after which everything's possible. So as long as we have that, there's no reason why terror at large would disappear in the country. And we're also trapped by the geography. France is a Mediterranean country. It's also the country where that has the biggest Muslim community in Europe. There is no way that the oligarchic powers on the Mediterranean are going to let a tolerant Islam or democratic form of Islam prosper at their border. They will do everything they can to control it at their profit. So
you're speaking when you say the oligarchic powers, you mean
Well, I mean, a lot of people in the 90s, it were the Algerian the Algerian Islamic networks, and through them the Saudis.
Right.
Today, it's clearly Turkey. Erdogan today is controlling the Islamic networks. If you will, you have two different branches of the Islamists of the Islamic networks in France. You have the Salafists, the Salafi, and you have the Muslim Brothers. The Salafi are more Saudi oriented, and the Muslim Brothers are by tradition either backed by Qatar, or today backed by Erdogan in Turkey. The fight between Macron and Erdogan is a geopolitical fight that sends us back to a debate that we can't have today on Europe, and how Erdogan's plan toward Europe are being played. But the consequence of that is that the Muslim Brothers, the networks of the Muslim Brothers in France are being activated as we speak.
Yeah.
The terror attacks that we suffered in last fall, for instance, with the beheading of the professor near Paris, and two other attacks, were not exactly ordered by Erdogan, of course, but they happened in a context where Erdogan was heavily propagandizing against France.
Well, Mark, on that note, I'd like to invite Suzanne Gordon back. Hi. And hoping now that I think of France as having been so far ahead of us with, wiring the country. And, there was a time when French telephones were so much more sophisticated than ours. I'm disappointed in your internet connection. Suzanne?
I am too, believe me, I am too.
Questions from attendees?
Yes, thank you both very much. There are lots of questions. Several people have asked if you could comment on any lasting effects from the Dreyfus affair.
Any lasting effects
of
from the Dreyfus affair today?
Mm-hmm.
Today it's a bit far. I'm not sure that there are direct effects of the Dreyfus affair that can be pointed out today. No, I don't think so. The Dreyfus affair, on the other hand, was clearly a turning point in French politics and French society. It left a huge mark on the country. It was a moment. It happened in a moment where anti-Semitism was so strong. Before Berlin and Vienna in 1920, you had Paris in 1900. This is really where the pre-fascist atmosphere erupted. The Protocol of the Elders of Zion, for instance, was written by two agents at the Russian embassy in Paris because they felt inspired by the atmosphere in the city. So basically, at the time, the first third of the 20th century in France was the time of the rabid anti-Semitism in the culture, in journalism, and pretty much everywhere. It prepared what followed. It prepared Pétain, if you will. It prepared the Vichy regime. And so that's all there is to say about the Dreyfus affair today, I think.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask two questions together. Is the French government actively involved in addressing the problems of anti-Semitism? And then somebody else wanted to know if the recent accords with some of the Arab countries, will it lessen maybe some of the anti-Semitism that's in France?
To the first question, yes, the French government has been very reactive to anti-Semitism, at least after 2010 and after 2012. But the problem is that this is the big difference with the Vichy regime, for instance. Anti-Semitism in that case today doesn't come from top down. It comes from the ground. It comes from the population. And so the problem we have is that the more the government gets involved in protecting the Jews, the more Jews are being accused of having a favored treatment. So it's a bit of a perverse trap, if you will. As for the second question, I'm not sure what the question is referring to. What accord?
The Israeli accords with the UAE, I would assume.
Oh, the Middle East. Does it have a consequence on France? Is that the question?
Yes, if there will be, if maybe that will lessen some of the anti-Semitism found in France.
I don't think so, because it's not really related. For instance, during the 90s, during the Oslo process and the peace process in the Middle East in the 90s, you had anti-Semitism was beginning to rise in the country. Anti-Semitism in France is not connected to the situation in the Middle East. It's connected to the narrative about the Middle East, which is very different. The narrative is different. If you understand what I'm saying, the narrative that is being passed along in France on what's going on in the Middle East has nothing to do with the reality on the ground in the Middle East, if you will. So whatever peace treaty can be signed between Arab countries and Israel will not stop the propaganda in France, for the very reason that, if you will, if the Saudis are signing a treaty with Israel, the Qataris and the Turks will be against it and will propagandize in France through Muslim Brothers networks. So it doesn't change anything, you know?
Someone would like to know, is there tension between the Ashkenazic Jews and the Sephardic Jews, and do they discriminate against each other?
No, not really. This is the classic joke, you know. There are a lot of jokes, but it never gets above that. There's no war between Ashkenazim and Sephardics in France. It may have been a social problem and social issue in Israel, but not in France.
Mm-hmm. Has COVID had an impact on anti-Semitism in France?
Such as, I don't think so. Such as what?
Well, I'm assuming you mean in the United States, you know, and around the world, there have been places where Jews have been blamed for this at times, and so there are rising.
Yeah, it's been, yes, a little bit, but I mean, we have other things on our plates, if you will. A few derogative sentences on COVID is not really, it doesn't change anything. No, it's not important.
We're just going to wrap up. We have a few more questions, but then we have to go. But several people, a lot of people have asked about the Jewish community and visiting France and the Jewish community, and how safe is it for people?
It's basically safe now more than it was a couple of years ago, but it's basically safe. It's not, as I said in the beginning, Jews don't live under siege in France. Things can happen and have happened and do happen, but not on not in a way that you could say, you know, I don't exactly know how to put this, because I hear myself talking, but I know that at the same time, when I take the subway, for instance, I pay attention not to read. If I read a book, I pay attention not to read anything in the subway. I wouldn't pick up a book with a Magen David on the cover, for instance. I would be careful. So there's that. There's a climate, if you will, of slight anxiety. That said, I'm not thinking every day, every minute of a physical danger. You don't live with the feeling of being, if you don't go to the projects, if you don't live in the project, you don't live with the feeling of permanent insecurity inside of Paris.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And to wrap it up, I'd love both of you to respond. Somebody had written in, what lessons can those of us in the United States learn from these examples and the hate in the U.S. towards the Asian American Pacific Islander communities that have again surfaced in full force here in the United States?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say it's hard to answer in one sentence, but I would say be careful of I don't know. In France, it started with the notion of respect. You know, respect my culture, respect my faith, respect, and this notion of respect very quickly led to something like your very presence is a mark of disrespect toward me.
Mm-hmm.
We've had a couple of anti-Asian attacks in France, you know, in the suburbs, in the cities. There is this clannish atmosphere. I belong to a tribe, therefore I can attack the other tribe. It's very pervasive in France, and and I'm afraid it's coming to the U.S. As well. You know, that would be one of the lessons. Don't be clannish. I don't know how to put it, in a sentence.
And I guess, did you want me to answer as well? I think what I would say is that I think that in France, and Marc was talking about this earlier, the official version of how different minority groups relate to Frenchness is, I frankly think it's bursting at the seams and not quite containing France of the 21st century. And in our case, we have a more open view of difference. But I think the objective is some balance, that for a country to remain united and to have some sense of commonness that transcends ethnic or religious background, we have to have some concept of being American that we all share. Mm-hmm. At the same time, a healthy regard for difference, not necessarily the superiority of one different group than the others, but it's an important, when America's been getting it right, it's always been an important virtue of ours, and we've not always gotten it right, for sure. But I think a sense of balance is what I'm really feeling we need.
Great, thank you. And on that note, we're going to have to end today's session. Thank you both. Marc,
thank you
so much for being up so late, all the way from Paris.
No, that's all right.
We're sorry about the technical difficulties, but that happens every so often. So it was a great session. Thanks for teaching us about the Jews in France and anti-Semitism, both in the past and the present. Thank you, Robert, for being a part of this conversation.
Yeah.
Yes, please, you can find Marc's book online on your local bookstores, The Rising Tide of Anti-Semitism in France. I want to remind everybody to go to momentmag.com, where you can sign up for next week's session on the making of Midnight Cowboy. And we will see you next week. Thank you all for joining us. Take care.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Suzanne.